Philip Zimbardo was professor at Stanford University, and he was interested in exactly that phenomenon that you were talking about there, which is what's the influence over human behavior, and how do ordinary people come to act in abnormal, cruel, or evil ways, if they're put under certain environmental kind of conditions, or if there are certain role expectations that are placed on them, if they're under an authority, or if there's an environment that's conducive to that. And so what he did was he constructed this experiment where they could observe people who were placed arbitrarily into those roles. And they set up within the basement of the university a mock prison environment with cells and all of those kinds of things. And then they took these college students and arbitrarily assigned them to prison officer or prisoner groups. And they started the whole experiment to keep it as realistic as possible by actually going out and doing a mock arrest of the people who were the prisoners, and bringing them to the university and taking them down into the basement. And the people who were involved were instructed to take on the role that they were assigned. So the prisoners were told to act like prisoners. The guards were told to act like guards. And it's become infamous as a psychological experiment because it went rapidly wrong. And what happened was it devolved very quickly over a course of just 2 days to the prison officers acting very cruelly towards the prisoners, including things like getting them to lick a toilet and making them stand for hours at a time, and doing these sorts of just nasty and malicious kind of things to the prisoners. What was really fascinating, I think, Emil, obviously there's the seeing how quickly ordinary college students could resort to this kind of behavior towards their fellow students just because they've been kind of assigned this role. So that's one area of interest. But I think how the experiment came to an end is also really instructive. And that was that there was a research assistant. She later became Philip Zimbardo's wife. And she spoke out about what was happening in the experiment. And the other people involved, including Zimbardo himself, were so engrossed in the experiment that they didn't have the objectivity to realize that what was happening was now unethical and that it couldn't continue. And it took her voice pointing that out for them to call off the experiment. And I think that highlights something really important for me about this important role of these voices of truth when you're in the midst of something of that nature.
Wow. That's huge. I love how you brought it around, and it didn't just highlight the type of twisted behavior we as humans are very adept at adopting depending on the roles that we are put in, but twisting, not twisting, but kind of circling around and say, all right, well, how do we become better in the things that we do? It's a huge one. It reminds me in a way of Muzaffar Sharif's experiments back in the 50s, where the children, young children, 10 years old, brought over to Robbers Cave National Park in Oklahoma in the States, and split into separate groups, and then brought together and just seen, once they'd formed their groups, how they would interact with one another. The most important thing that changed their behavior towards the end was when they were paired or mixed in such a way that they had to work together to overcome a particular goal, like fixing up the water reservoir that was broken at the camp, or pulling a truck that was bogged, or pooling their money, their resources together to have enough money to watch a film. These were the things that helped. It's a really, really important point.
I think another thing about these psychological experiments that I find interesting is the response and the criticism of them. All of the ones that we've mentioned so far, the Stanford experiment, the Robbers Cave that you've talked about, have all been systematically attacked for the methodology of the experiments and the way in which they were conducted, whether they were ethical or not. Some other ones that I've talked about as well, same sort of story. And I find that quite curious, because what seems to motivate the criticisms is an underlying ideological belief that people are inherently good. And so these experiments where people have devolved into these behaviors need to be shown up for the fakery that they are, in their view, because people wouldn't do this unless they were sort of coerced into it. And I think you going back to Rousseau that you were talking about before, and this idea of what is human nature, and there, in my view, there is a dark side to human nature. And, one way to think about that might be Carl Jung's idea of the shadow. But under certain conditions, we see that come out, and it seems to be able to come out quite rapidly. But yeah, I find that really interesting, that people are quick to dismiss those experiments and the things that they discovered, because there seems to be, I think, a fear in them about what people are really capable of, and perhaps even a desire not to look into what they personally might be capable of under similar circumstances. None of us want to think that we would be the Nazi guard at the prison camp. We all think that we would be the person hiding the Jews. That's how we like to imagine ourselves. But the reality is that more likely, under those circumstances, we would be the ones going along with the group.